In 1519, Hernan Cortés, a great Spanish conquistador, and 600 men landed on a beach in what is now Mexico. They were there on a mission to conquer one of the most resilient nations on earth. A people so fierce that they had held off many potential invaders with armies far greater than Cortez's 600 men. When Cortez arrived with his men on the sandy beaches of the Yucatan, instead of immediately marching off to war, he brought them all out onto the beach and he sat them down. And he started telling them stories. Stories of gold. Stories of the vast ancient wealth of the Aztecs. And he was trying to get them fired up. And the reason why was because he could see the fear in his men's eyes. He could see that they had heard the legends of the Aztecs. He could see that they had heard what happened to other armies that had tried to take them over. And he was trying to get them excited and give them courage. He saw the fear of the unknown and the fear of failure in their eyes. He saw the fear of death. And then Cortez, with 3 simple words, changed the course of history. He took a slow look at all his men, and he said, "Quemar los barcos." Burn the boats. And his men looked at him and said, "You are crazy." No, I'm just kidding. They didn't. Actually, they did exactly what they were told. They fired the boats. They sank every ship they rode in on. And they sat there on the beach and watched them go down in flames. And then Cortez gave them a decision. He offered them a choice: prevail or die. Today I want to talk to you about the link between commitment, sacrifice, and success. Cortez wasn't the first military commander to employ the tactic of boat burning. It was actually something that was done fairly commonly. It was done by Alexander the Great. He went up against a Persian army 4 times the size of his own, and he did the same thing. He burned the boats. The Romans used to do it whenever they would cross a bridge. They would burn the bridge behind them and seal off any chance of retreat of their own men. They didn't leave themselves any outs. And both Cortez and Alexander were victorious, and many attribute that success of these daunting campaigns to the fact that their men didn't have anywhere to flee. Their men had no choice but to move forward and either prevail or die. We've all heard the phrase, "my back's against the wall." And usually that's followed with some story about some action that the person was able to take that they maybe wouldn't have ordinarily been able to take if their backs weren't against the wall, right? My back was against the wall, so I did this. And, it's indicative of I wouldn't have been able to do that. I would have chosen to turn around and go where the wall was, but I wasn't able to. There was a wall there. So I conquered. I did whatever was necessary to be done. Human beings, like much of God's creation, have a fight or flight thing built into us, mechanism built into us. And it's for reasons of survival. It's for reasons of self-preservation. There are exceptions, but usually it works in a very simple way. You can imagine a raccoon, right, finds a fish. And it's a fish that a bear really wants. And so the raccoon has a choice, and he very quickly has to make this decision. He's starving, and his little raccoon babies are starving, right? But the bear wants the fish, so he has to decide whether he's going to stand and fight for his food, or if he's going to run, fight or flight. And he very quickly makes this decision. And he sizes up the bear, and then he acts. And we do a similar thing spiritually. Spiritually, I think of it along the same lines of counting the cost, and that might not seem related, but it is. If you look in Luke 14 and verse 31, We've all read this scripture before, Luke 14 and verse 31. It's a scripture about counting the cost. It says, what king going to make war against another king, doesn't first sit down and consider whether with his 10,000 men, he can go against his enemy with 20,000. What king does just rush into battle without saying, okay, how many troops do you have, and how many troops do I have? And boy, let me look at your artillery, let me look at mine. Ooh, I'm not sure this one's going to work out for us. Kings do that. That's one of the things that they do. In verse 32, or else while the other is still a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for conditions of peace. That's why they do it, right? So that if they need to, they can go, this one's not going to work out. So likewise, whoever of you does not forsake all that he has cannot be my disciple. I think it's really interesting language that Jesus uses in this scripture, that he says cannot. Whoever cannot. So what he's saying here, count the cost. I think it's important to understand. I think a lot of times we think of counting the cost and think, yeah, okay, I get it. We count the cost, meaning, we see, how difficult it's going to be, and we figure out if we want to tackle that, and then, okay, we've counted the cost. But I think the really, really important thing about counting the cost to remember is that when something costs something, you have to pay for it. You have to give something to buy that. That's the cost. Whatever you're paying is equal to the cost. And so what he's saying here is, I want you to look down the road. If you want to follow me, I want you to look down this road that I'm going to ask you to walk. And I want you to look at what you're going to have to sacrifice. I want you to look at what you're going to have to pay. Look at the cost. Look how much this will cost you. And figure out if that is something that you can pay. Count that cost. And then he says, and if you're not willing to say, okay, it could cost me everything. It could cost me everything I have, my job, my family, my life, whatever it is. If you're not willing to look at that and say, I'm willing to give that up and be sincere about that, then you cannot be my disciple. And he's not saying, it'll be hard to be my disciple. It'll be hard to walk this walk. It'll be hard to be in my kingdom. He's saying it can't happen. It just can't. And he's saying that because he knows what we will have to give up. He knows. He knows that if we follow him, there is going to be a point in our lives that we're going to have to decide whether or not we're willing to give up everything. It's going to come. And it might not come all at once, but it's going to come. And if we can't, that's what he needs. He needs followers that can do that, because it's not going to get any easier. He needs followers that can do what he did. So let me ask you this, because we've all read 1 Peter 4:17. We know that judgment is now for God's people. Judgment is now for God's family and for the house of God. Do you ever look down this road? Look down, look up at the mountain that you've chosen to climb. And does it ever seem a bit much to you? Do you ever look up at it and think, this is a lot. This is a lot of work. This is a lot of energy to be able to live this out for the rest of my life to my last breath, obeying and serving and following God for the rest of my life. It's a lot. I think sometimes it can be daunting if you back up and you count the cost and you say, okay, what is it going to cost me? It can seem like a large amount. And as human beings, a fight or flight thing can kick in. So how do we do it? How do we live this fearless life where we're fearlessly pursuing God? How do we live that out? Jesus Christ gives us a tip in Matthew 5. This is a chapter that we probably have read maybe more than any other chapter. This is one of the most read chapters to all of us in the Bible. I mean, this is God in the flesh giving a sermon, right? So this is amazing stuff. And in Matthew 5, in verse 29, Matthew 5, verse 29. Excuse me. He says, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. Now, the English words there make that sound pretty simple, especially the word pluck. Like it's just like, you just pluck it out. Like it's no big deal. Just pluck it out, throw it away, you'll be fine, and you'll enter my kingdom. But think about what that is. If you had another word there, if it was tear it out, if your right eye causes you to sin, pull your eye out of your head and throw it away. That's more, if you can imagine that, and I'm not trying to gross anybody out, but if you can imagine what that is like, I think it gives us a better idea of what he's saying here. For it's better that one of your members would perish than for your whole body to burn, right? And then again, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off, and cast it from you. Again, cutting your hand off. My point is that he uses very, very extreme language here. This is a very, very extreme analogy here that he's giving. He doesn't say, if your coat caused you to sin, slip it off, hang it up, put it away, and walk. He doesn't say, if your sandals cause you to sin, slide them off and set them aside. It's not that type of thing. It's not that type of analogy. He's using very, very extreme language here, and he's doing it for a reason. Because he knows that's what's appropriate. That is the analogy that is what is appropriate to what he's asking us to do. Shoes don't fit. Cutting a body part off fits. Now we know he's not being literal here. He doesn't expect us to start cutting our body parts off. But he's saying that there's nothing that is worth not sacrificing for what I am asking, for what I am offering you. There's nothing that stacks up. There's nothing that you shouldn't be willing to give up if it's keeping you from me. He knew how extreme the language was. He knew that it would be the hardest thing that we've ever done. Some of the sacrifices that we have made, are as painful as cutting a body part off. And we have to be ready to do that, or we cannot be his disciple. We need to be able to burn it down if necessary. Darius McNeely, a lot of you know who Darius McNeely is because of Beyond Today. He's a minister in the United Church of God. And Darius McNeely gives a sermon that you can find online about disciple making, about discipleship. And it's a great sermon. But one of the things that he brings out is that one of the defining characteristics of a disciple of Jesus Christ is that they're willing to sacrifice whatever is needed to sacrifice to be a disciple. And if they weren't willing to do that, they wouldn't be a disciple. That's one of the defining characteristics. That's one of the things that makes them a disciple, is that they're willing to just burn it down, give it up, and follow Jesus Christ. And I want to look at a quick example that he gave in 1 Kings that has to do with this. 1 Kings, I did not write down what chapter. I think it's 19. I'm pretty sure it's 1 Kings 19. 1 Kings 19. Yep. 1 Kings 19 in verse 15. So this is the story of Elijah. And he appoints a successor. So God tells Elijah, I want you to go and appoint this king over Israel and this king over Syria, and then I want you to appoint your successor. It's time to name your successor and train him up and prepare him to be my prophet, and that's Elisha, right? And so in verse 15, he says, go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, anoint Hazael as king over Syria, and then anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. And then, and Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel Meloah, you shall appoint as prophet in your place. So he tells him to go do this. Okay, I want you to go, and I want you to find these 3 people and do this. And then if we go down to verse 19, he departed from there, and he found Elisha, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he was with the 12th. So he finds him working in a field. So Elisha was farming. He was plowing a field. And there's this row of oxen, these 12 oxen with 12 plows, and he was with the 12th, and he's working. And he goes up to Elisha, and he throws his mantle on him, or his cloak on him. And that was symbolic of the passing of the torch. It was symbolic of passing of the authority and taking him under his wing. And so he goes and does this, and Elisha immediately knows what it means. We go on here in verse 19. Then Elijah passed by him and threw his mantle on him, and he left the oxen and ran after Elijah. So Elijah throws his mantle on him and walks away, and Elisha goes chasing after him. And he says, "Please let me kiss my father and mother, and then I will follow you." And he said to him, "Go back again, for what have I done to you?" So Elisha turned back from him. Okay, so here's what Elisha does. So Elijah comes, and he's a prophet of God, so it's like God coming. And he says, "Listen, I'm going to throw my mantle on you. It's time for you to come work for me now. It's time for you to come and do this with your life now." And so he says, "Okay, let me go say goodbye to my parents and do the honorable thing there." He's thinking of the 4th commandment. He's thinking of honoring his father and mother. Let me go do that. And then I'm going to come and I'm going to follow you. And so what he does here is he takes his plow and he busts it to pieces. And he lights it on fire. And then he takes his oxen and he butchers it. And he has a feast. He invites all the people he was working with, probably Elijah, doesn't say that, maybe some other people he lived around, and they have a feast. And then he gets up and he follows Elijah. And Mr. McNeely was making the point that he didn't have anything to go back to. There's this worldly wisdom that tells us, leave yourself out. You don't destroy your only means of making a living. That is foolish. That's ridiculous. That's a bad decision. But godly wisdom tells you, don't leave yourself any outs, because what's going to happen is when times get tough, as a prophet of God, which they often did, when things get a little hairy, you're going to want to go back to the plow. It's going to start looking really, really good. It's going to start looking like, boy, that was a simple life. I was happy, and I had a way to provide for my family. I had a way to make a living, and I could go back to that. I could go get my plow, get my oxen, and hit that field, and everything would be okay. And he burns it down. He doesn't leave his boat sitting on that shore. He doesn't give himself any outs. He puts the wall against his back. One thing that is very clear from Scripture is that God does not he hates lukewarm, fence-sitting, seat-warming Christianity. He hates it. In Revelation, he says it makes him sick. He wants to spew it out of his mouth. He says, I wish you were hot or cold, because I can live with that. I know what to do with that. But since you're lukewarm and you have one foot in and one foot out, I want to spit you out of my mouth. It makes me sick. I can't stand the taste of that. And so we can't walk into the jungle and leave our boat on the shore, so that when things get hard in the jungle, we have something to retreat to. This is do or die for us. And I think when you start to think in those terms, it actually is very liberating. It actually frees you up, because you don't have to worry about going back. You don't have to worry about what's behind you. A good example, I think, is marriage. We all live in a country where marriage is failing. Divorce is winning. The divorce statistic keeps going up and up every year. And far more people now in this country are getting divorced than staying together. Marriage is a failing institution in our nation. And one of the things that happens is that, the more a married couple will allow themselves to leave divorce and separation as an option on the table, the harder it is for them to work through and reconcile their differences when things get really, really hard, when things get rough. We would all love to say that our marriages are perfect, but they're not. And sometimes things can get tough, especially early on, early in our marriage, when things are new and we're figuring each other out and we're growing in love, things can get rough. And if divorce is on the table, if the boat is on the shore, because sometimes you get in a marriage and you're like, a year in, you're like, whoa, what did I do, right? And all of a sudden, you start looking back at that boat, and you start thinking, that's looking pretty good. I could get in that boat, smooth sailing. I could go back to Spain. I got an apartment in Madrid, whatever it is, and it's looking pretty good. And that's what he's saying. Burn it down. Don't give yourself an option. If they would take divorce and separation off of the table, it doesn't leave them a choice. Their back's against the wall. You go figure it out. All of a sudden, your energy starts turning because you don't want to be miserable. You don't want to be miserable. So I'm going to go figure this out. We're going to work this out because we don't have a choice. That's it. We made the commitment. It's the same thing with God. God describes our relationship as a marriage, and we're the bride. And it's that same idea. If divorce is off the table, then figure it out. Then move forward. Put your energy, look it forward, and work it out. There's a parable, my favorite parable, that I bring up probably in every sermon I give, and one that I talk to to brethren about a lot, and that's the parable of treasure in the field. To me, this is the same. It goes back to that same concept. It's understanding the value. We measure as human beings. We measure what is in our lives and what we love and what we hold on to and what makes us happy with God. And it's crazy. That is a crazy thing to do. And the parable of the guy in the field in Matthew 13, he goes and he finds this treasure in a field, and he immediately recognizes its value. He doesn't compare it. He doesn't go, okay, that's a lot of treasure. That looks pretty good. I'm going to go back and count my stuff up and figure out if it's worth selling so that I can have a little more with this. No, he goes and he's like, whoa, this is it. This is what this is everything I've been looking for. This is everything that I need. I'm just going to go. And he goes back and he sells everything. He gets rid of everything. He just burns it down so he can go buy this field because it is so vastly better than what he has in front of him, than what he has in his life. There's nothing that isn't worth sacrificing to him. He just goes. And sometimes I think we can do this thing where we measure God and our stuff, or God and our relationships, or God and our hobbies, or our interests, or whatever it is that's important to us, whatever it is that is a barrier between us and God. And we can kind of go, well, okay, God's here, and God's just like, are you crazy? You're out of your mind. You have this little rock with these little tiny people on it, and they're actually measuring me, God, back here, with all their stuff, with all their worldly stuff. It's crazy. It doesn't make any sense. None of this matters. The only thing that matters is that we follow him and that we're with him, and that when he comes back, he finds us so doing. That's it. So let's put this boat burning principle into action. Let's look at our lives and evaluate honestly, because it takes a lot of honesty. It's hard to pull an eye out and do something that painful, and because of that difficulty, it's a lot easier to turn a blind eye. No pun intended. But it's a lot easier to not think about it like that. It's not easier to put it out of your mind than it is just. So we look at ourselves honestly and figure out whether or not we've got ships waiting on the shore, or whether we're not in that jungle moving forward with nothing, no thoughts of turning around. He says, if You put your hand to the plow and you look back, you're not fit for my kingdom. Once you've tasted that, if you want to go back, then I don't want you in my kingdom. That's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for people who understand my value and are willing to just say, wow, nothing else matters. Let's just go do this. That's it. Is there anything more important to us than him? We might say no, but what do our actions say? If we could ask God, what would he say? If you could ask God about me, hey, is there anything more important to Justin than you? What would he say? What would he say? There's no room for error on this one. We're in or we're out. And if we're in, then let's burn our boats down and move forward.